One should merely start to move forward in the dark, feeling one's way and trying to do good. But for the rest, one should remain and agree and put oneself in God's hands, even concerning the death of children without seeking any personal solution. Here Father Panley recalled the towering figure of Bishop Belzard during the plague of Marseille. He reminded his listeners that towards the end of the epidemic, after the bishop had done everything that he thought he should, believing that there was no further remedy, he took some supplies and shut himself up in his house, which he had walled up. The inhabitants of the city had idolized him, and the changing of feelings, such as to find the excess of misfortune, became agreeing against him, surrounded his house with corpses, and infected him with even threw bodies over the walls, and answered that he would be more certain to die. So the bishop, in his last of his weakness, had thought that he could isolate himself from the world of death, but the dead was falling from the heavens on his head. The same must be true with us. We must not believe that there is an island of the plague. No, there is no middle way. We must accept the outrage because we have chosen to hate God or to love him. And who could choose hatred of God? My brethren, Father Panelou said at last, announcing that he was coming to an end. The love of God is a difficult love. It amuses the total abnegation of oneself and the contempt of one's person. But it also can wipe away the suffering and the death of children, and alone makes them necessary because it's impossible to understand such things, so we have no alternative except to desire him. This is the hard lesson that I wanted to share with you. This is the faith cruel in the eyes of man, deceptive in the eyes of God, which we must try to reach. We must try to make ourselves equal in this awful image. On the peaks, everything that will be confounded and made equal, and the truth will break forth from apparent injustice. This is why in many churches in the south of France, plague victims have slept for centuries beneath the stones of the choir, and the priests speak above the tombs, and the spirits that proclaim rise out of the heavens in heaps of ashes, even though children are among those who go to make them. When Ryu left the church, a sharp wind poured through the half-open door and struck the congregation full in the face. It brought the smell of rain into the church and the scent of damp pavement, which warned them of how the town would look even before they went out. Walking in front of Dr. Ryu, the old priest and the young deacon, who were leaving at the same time, had difficulty keeping hold of their headgear. Nonetheless, the old man went on speaking about the sermon. He paid tribute to Panelou's eloquence, but was worried that the audacity of the priest's ideas. He considered that the sermon betrayed more uneasy than strength at Panelou's age. The priest did not have the right to be uneasy. The young deacon, who had bent in protest against himself with the wind, insisted that he saw a lot in Father Panelou, and he knew about the development, and he thought that the trustees would be much more daring. It would certainly not have the official imprimatur. So what's his idea? The old priest asked. He had reached the space in front of the church, and the wind was howling around them, making it hard for the young man to speak. When he could do so, he said merely, "If the priest consults a doctor, there is a contradiction." When Ryu told him what Paolu had said, Teru remarked that he knew a priest who had lots of faith during the war, and he saw the face of a young man with its eye torn out. Paolu is right, said Teru. When inconsequence has an eye gorged out, a Christian must lose faith or accept that the gorging out of eye. Paolu does not want to lose his faith, but he will stick with it to the very end, and that's what he meant. Does the remark of Teru's help with little explain the unfortunate events that followed? It was which Paolu's behavior seemed incomprehensible, and those around him. One must judge for oneself. Indeed, a few days after the sermon, Paolu decided to move house. This was the time when the progress of the illness was the cause of the constant removal of the town. Just as Teru had to leave his hotel to stay with Ryu, it was the priest who had to leave the apartment in which his order had placed him to take lodging with an old woman, a regular churchgoer, in the fair immune of the plague. During the move itself, the priest felt his anxiety and exhaustion grow. This is how he lost the respect of the landlady, one who said she was warmly exhilarating the merest of the prophecies of Saint Odell. The priest made a very slight gesture of impatience, no doubt due to his tardiness. From then on, whatever effort he made to win the old lady around to at least a friendly neutrality was unsuccessful. He made be a bad impression, and every evening before going up to his room, which was filled with yards of lacework, he had to look at her back, seated in her drawing room, and to take away the memory of the good evening's father. She addressed him in a dry voice without turning around. It was such an evening as he was going to bed, his head aching, and he felt the tired of fever which had been brewing for several days break out on his wrist and his temples. What followed was afterwards, knowing only through the accounts of his landlady. The morning she got up early, as usual. After a while, surprised at not seeing the priest come down out of his room, she decided with much hesitation to knock on his door. She found him still in bed after a sleepless night. He was having difficulty breathing and seemed more flushed than usual. She later said she politely suggested calling the doctor, but this idea was rejected and she with what she found unacceptable force. She could do nothing but leave. A little later the priest rang and asked for her. He apologized for his irritation and told her that it could not be a case of plague, since he had none of the symptoms. It was just a temporary fatigue. The old lady replied with a definitive manner that her suggestion did not arise from the anxiety of that sort, and that she was not considering her own safety, in which was in the hands of God, but that she was merely thinking of the father's health, and which she felt partly responsible. But since he did not add anything, his landlady anxiously, so she said, was on her duty, again suggested calling her doctor. The priest once more refused, while adding some explanation that the old lady considered to be confused. The only thing she thought that she had understood, which seemed incomprehensible to her, was that the father was refusing the consultation with a doctor because it was against his principles. She decided that the fever was disrooting her tantrum mind, and did nothing except bring him some herb tea. Still determined to fulfill precisely the duties of the situation imposed on her, she visited the patient regularly every 2 hours. What struck her for the most forcefully was that the state of continual agitation in which the priest spent the days. He would throw off his bedclothes, pull them back over him, constantly passing his head across the forehead, and often sitting up in an attempt to cough, with a stifled, hoarse, damp cough, and through tears sometimes out of himself, and was as though he could not bring some pieces of cotton wool from the back of his throat and was choking them. After these cries, he would slump back with every appearance of exhaustion. In the end, he would again sit half up, and the brief moment looked directly ahead with the consideration that was most passionate than those of turmoil had gone before. But the old lady was still uncertain whether to call the doctor and go against her patient's wishes. This might be a simple high-temperature spectacular through it may be. However, that afternoon she tried to speak to the priest, who replied with only a few confused words. She made this suggestion once more, and the priest sat upright and, half suffocating, replied in a clear voice that he did not want a doctor, and the landlady decided that she would not wait until the next morning, and Father's condition had not improved. She would telephone the number of the InfoDoc agency, repeat a dozen times a day on the radio. Still attentive in her duty, she thought that she would visit the tenant in the night and keep watch over him. But that evening she had given him some fresh herb tea. She felt like laying down for a while and did not wake up until early hours the next day. She ran up to the room. The priest was stretched out motionless. The consideration flush and the days before had given way to some sort of vivid color, which was all the more notable since the features were still puffy. He was staring at the little lamp and the multicolored glass beads hanging over the bed. When the old lady came, he turned towards her. According to her account, he looked at the moment as though he had been bitten all night and had lost all strength to react. She asked him how he was. The voice, which she said had a strange, indifferent sound. He said that he was ill and he did not need a doctor, and it would be enough to take him to the hospital, for everything would be in order. Horrified, the old lady ran to the telephone. Ryu arrived at noon, and the landlady told him that what had happened, and he was simply that Pan Lu was right and that it was probably too late. The priest greeted him with the same air of indifference. Ryu exclaimed that he was not surprised to find any of the men's main symptoms of bubonic or the primarily plague, except the congestion and the difficulty in breathing. In any case, the pulse was so slow that the general state of health so alarming that there was little hope. So, you have none of the main symptoms of the disease, he told Pan Lu. But to tell the truth, there is some doubt that I must put you in isolation. The priest gave an odd smile, as though out of politeness, but said nothing. Ryu left to make the telephone call and come back. He looked at the priest. I shall stay beside you, he said softly. The other man seemed relieved and turned towards the doctor with eyes of which short warmth seemed to have returned. Then he pronounced the following with difficulty in such a way that it was impossible to know if he was speaking with sadness or not. Thank you, he said, but priests have no friends. They have given everything to God. He asked for the crucifix, which was at the head of the bed, and when he had it turned to look at it. In the hospital, Pan Lu kept his teeth clenched. He gave himself up like an object to all treatment, and he endured but did not let go of the crucifix. However, the priest's case remained ambiguous. Ryu was not certain in his mind it was the plague, and yet it wasn't. As a matter of fact, for some time the disease had seemed to enjoy upsetting medical diagnosis, but in Pan Lu's case, the outcome would show that the uncertainty was without importance. The temperature rose, cough grew more and more hoarse, and tortured the patient throughout the day. Finally, in the evening, the priest coughed up a cotton wool and had been suffocating him, and it was red. In the midst of his rage fever, Pan Lu kept a look of indifference, and when the following day they found him dead, half falling out of bed, there was nothing to the red in its expression. They wrote on his card, doubtful case. On All Souls' Day that year, the difference was usual, and the weather was certainly appropriate. It had changed abruptly, and the late heat that had given way overnight to chills. As in other years, the cold wind was now blowing continuously. Large clouds spread from one end of the horizon to the other, casting shadows over the houses before the cold golden light of November returned to from the clouds that passed by. But first the mosquitoes made their appearance, but one could also see a surprising number of shiny rubberized material, and newspapers had reported that 200 years earlier, in the Great Plague of the south of France, doctors used to wear oilcloths with their own protection, and shops took advantage of this, unloaded supplies of oilcloths that were no longer in fashion, from which everyone hoped to gain immunity. However, all these seasonal indicators could not disguise the fact that the cemeteries were deserted. Over the years, the trams had been full of vivid sanctity of charitism, and the proportions of women making their way to the places of their loved ones were buried to put flowers on the graves. This had been the day that people tried to make up for the dead for leaving them alone and forgetting them for so many long months. But this year no one wanted to think about the dead, for the very reason that they had already been thinking too much about them. It was no longer a matter of going back to see them with little remorse and lots of melancholy. There was no longer the forgotten ones, but the visited in the self-justification one day a year. There was no intruders about whom would rather forget. This was why the Feast of the Dead the year was somewhat brushed aside. True noticed that Qatar's language had become more and more ironic. According to him, every day was the Feast of the Dead. Indeed, the bonfires of the pike burned ever more cheerfully in the crematorium. Admittedly, the number of dead from one day to the next was not rising, but it seemed that the plague was settling comfortably into its peak and was carrying out its daily murders, with the precaution of the regulatory of the good civil servants. In the theory, the opinion of the experts is that it's a good sign. The graph of the progression of the plague started with a constant rise, followed by a long plateau, seemed quite reassuring. For Dr. Richard, for example, good, an excellent graph, he said. He reckoned that the disease had reached what he called the ceiling, and from here on it could only decrease. He accepted this as Castell's new serum, which had indeed achieved some unexpected success. Old Castell did not contradict him, but felt that one could not predict anything for certain, since his history of the epidemic showed that there could be a flare-up again unexpectedly. The prefecture had for a long time wanted to appease public anxieties, something that the plague had not allowed it to do, and was deciding to get the medical experts together to report on the topic. When Dr. Richard, too, was carried off by the plague, just as the epidemic reached a plateau. Though this case after all proved nothing, it was impressive that the authorities confronted by it slipped back into permission with little justification, as they had at first welcomed Richard's optimism. Castell, for his part, was content and prepared his serum as continuously as he could. There was only one public place that was not transformed into a hospital or an isolation facility, and if the prefecture was still given immunity, it was because they had to keep one place where people could meet. But on the whole, because the relative stability of the epidemic at this time, the organized RIU proved sufficient, and the doctor and their assistants, who were undertake exhausting tasks, did not have the complete or greater efforts. They merely had to continue this superhuman work with regular manner, one may say. The primality forms in the infection and already appeared to have multiplied in every part of town, as though the wind and the lighting of fanning flames in people's chests. The supper did much more quickly, vomiting blood. The degree of congestion threatened a greater with the new forms of the epidemic. Though the opinions of the specialists had always been contradicting on this point. Meanwhile, for maximum safety, the health workers continued to breathe through masks and disinfected gauze. In any case, one would have expected the disease to spread, but since the number of cases of bubonic plague was falling, the figure stayed level. However, there might be other reasons for anxiety because the infected difficulties was getting food supplies. Spectaculars was involved in vital necessities unobtainable by the ordinary market and being offered in huge prices. Poor families consequently found themselves in a very difficult situation, while the rich lacked a spectacular nothing, because in the efficient impartiality which had brought the administration on the plague should have worked in greater equality among our fellow citizens through the normal interplay of egotism. By the fact of the heightened of feeling injustice in the hearts of men, of course no one could fault the equality of death. But it was not one of anybody wanted, and the poor who suffered in the way of the hunger through the great nostalgia that ever the neighboring towns and villages were left where life was free and bread was cheap. Since they could not properly nourish, they had to rather unreasonable feelings that they should have been allowed to leave. So much so that some eventually defeated the slogan that you could read sometimes on walls, in which at other times was shouted at the prefect when he went past, "Bread or air." The ironic phrase was a signal of demonstration that rapidly surpassed, though no one doubted its seriousness. Naturally, the newspapers followed the order that had been taken, and the optimistic at any cost. Reading them, you would think that the main characteristics of the situations was the moving example of calm and courage shown by the people, but in the town shut in on itself where nothing could remain secret, no one had any illusion of the example given by the population. And to get the correct notion of the calm and courage in the question, one had only to go to the place of quarantine or one of isolation camps that the authorities had set up. As it happens, the narrator was busy elsewhere and did not have this experience, so he can only quote the evidence provided by Theroux. In his notebook, Theroux describes the visit he made with Rambert in the camp situation in the multiple stadiums. The stadium stands almost at the gate of the town, having on one side of the street down which trains passed, and on the other some waste ground, and that extends as far as the edge of the plateau on which the town was built. Normally it is surrounded by high concrete walls, and it was enough to put the sentries at the four entrances and make escape difficult. In the same way, the walls prevented curious people outside from causing the nuisance to those unfortunate who were placed in quarantine. On the other hand, the latter could not hear the trams passing all day long and guess from the noises they brought with them that the time for the people to go or to leave work. In this way, they were informed about the life from which they had excluded continued a few matters away from them, and that the concrete wall separated two worlds and the foreign to the others as if they had been different planets. The day after Theroux and Rambert chose to go to the stadium was the Sunday afternoon. They were accompanied by Gonzalez and the football player whom Rambert had discovered, who eventually agreed to manage supervision over the stadium of the Rotunda system. Rambert, who was presented him to the camp administrator. When they met, Gonzalez told the two men that this was the time when he used to get dressed to start his match. In the days before the plague, now the sports ground had been requisitioned and no longer possible for Gonzalez, felt and looked entirely at loose ends. This was one of the reasons why he had accepted the job as a supervisor, as long as he only had to work on the weekends. The sky was half covered in the clouds, and Gonzalez stifled the air. Regretfully observed the weather neither rainy nor hot. This was just the right for a good match. He recalled as the best as he could smell the apparatus of the dressing room. The rickety stands, the bitty-colored jerseys, and the tawny pitch and the high-time lemons, or lemonade, would trickle dry throats with thousands of refreshing bubbles. True noted, moreover, that through the whole journey through the run-down streets of the working-class quarters, the players would continually kick any pebbles that laid in his path. He tried to send them straight into draining holes, and when he succeeded, he would say 1-0, and he would finish his cigarette, spat down the butt in front of him, and would try to drop kick it. Some children were playing near the stadium, kicking the balls towards the impressing groups, and Gonzalez took the trouble to send it neatly back to them.